In December 1991, the map of the world effectively shattered. The rigid, two-sided standoff that defined global politics for half a century was officially over. When Mikhail Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time, it appeared to mark the definitive end of the traditional Cold War model. For decades, that model was structurally straightforward. Two superpowers avoided direct nuclear confrontation by funding, arming, and directing localized around the globe. While the Soviet Union dissolved, the architectural framework of the proxy war remained intact. It merely adapted to its new environment. The primary weapons deployed in these conflicts transitioned from strictly military hardware to the levers of macroeconomic manipulation. The battleground shifted from a bipolar standoff to a multipolar network. Power dynamics fractured, integrating new, heavily resourced actors like China and a rapidly developing global south.
Look closely at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is a localized border war, but it serves simultaneously as the premier blueprint for how hybridized proxy wars are fought today. The first major front of this new battlefield relies on the weaponization of economic sanctions and the forced rerouting of international trade. The second highly effective front operates by manipulating the world's agricultural supply chains to generate geopolitical leverage. Modern proxy conflicts demand a new metric for victory. Success depends on weaponizing the vital arteries of global trade, alongside traditional military force. Let's examine the mechanics of modern economic warfare. The explicit goal of Western sanctions is rarely to trigger an immediate catastrophic collapse of an adversary's economy. Instead, they enforce structural constraint over time. The primary target of these measures is the energy sector, specifically the massive state revenues generated by crude oil exports. This requires a delicate balance. A total embargo on Russian oil would trigger severe global supply shocks and price spikes. To avoid this, the G7 and EU implemented a price cap, allowing the oil to flow but artificially suppressing the profit margin. This chart illustrates average prices between 2023 and 2024. The top line represents the global benchmark, North Sea dated oil. The bottom line tracks Russian Urals crude. Between them sits a persistent $14 per barrel deficit, acting as a sanction tax siphoning state funds. To maintain export volumes under this pressure, trade routes had to pivot aggressively away from traditional European markets, shifting toward buyers in India and China. This pivot introduces massive logistical friction. Shipping crude from ports in the Baltic Sea to Asia drastically increases maritime transit distances. Extended transit times equal higher shipping costs, which directly transfers pricing leverage away from the seller and into the hands of the new concentrated buyers. Those buyers know their supplier has limited alternatives, allowing them to demand further discounts. This compounds the financial loss, severely cutting into the mineral extraction taxes that fund the state. Economic sanctions act as a forced systemic friction cost. They do not build an impenetrable economic wall. They function as a slow, deliberate drain on the aggressor's war chest. An economic siege inevitably triggers adaptation. The primary countermeasure to the price cap is the deployment of a shadow fleet. This is a complex maritime network utilizing opaque ownership structures and non-Western insurance to transport fossil fuels, completely bypassing international price controls. Bypassing the oil cap addresses revenue, but does not solve a second critical vulnerability, securing the high-tech components required for military production. Direct export controls have been highly effective at the source. Shipments of technology directly from Western nations to the target state have dropped precipitously. The counter-tactic here is intermediary routing. To secure microchips and drone components, purchasing agents now launder their supply chains through third-party nations. This bar chart tracks high-priority sanctioned goods. While direct Western imports collapsed, imports of electronic circuits and transistors from partner countries increased dramatically. The data reveals clear geographic nodes. Western components flow through Central Asia, Turkey, and China before crossing the border. This workaround carries a steep financial penalty. Intermediary sellers apply massive markups, forcing the sanctioned state to pay 40 to 60% more for the exact same components. When authentic parts are unavailable or too expensive, buyers substitute them with influxes of lower quality components, which directly degrades overall military capability on the ground. In a deeply interconnected, multipolar economy, embargoes are highly porous. Their true strategic value lies in forcing the adversary to constantly overpay for inferior technology. The final and most expansive geoeconomic weapon deployed in this framework targets global food security. The extensive damage to agricultural infrastructure in Ukraine serves a calculated, dual-purpose geopolitical strategy, treating the food supply as a primary target of war. Look at the sheer scale of devastation. Beyond the destruction of major irrigation systems like the Kakhovka Dam, millions of acres of arable farmland have been rendered unusable by landmines. The immediate, localized goal of these attacks is to cripple the target nation's GDP and choke off one of its most vital sources of export revenue. The secondary goal is global. By systematically disabling a major agricultural exporter, you engineer a massive supply vacuum in the international grain market. The macroeconomic fallout of that vacuum hits the poorest nations hardest. As global supplies tightened, low-income nations experienced localized food price inflation of 15 to 30%. This creates the strategic pivot. The aggressor can now step in to exploit the exact crisis it engineered. As Ukrainian agricultural output plummets, Russian wheat exports have surged to record-breaking levels, aided by favorable growing conditions and massive logistical capacity. This surplus is weaponized for diplomatic gain. The state targets the resulting food insecurity by offering free or heavily discounted grain shipments to vulnerable nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Somalia. By actively destroying a competitor's harvest and substituting its own product to fill the gap, an adversary converts kinetic military destruction into highly potent diplomatic soft power across the global south. If you pull back and view the entire macroeconomic battlefield, you can see how these disparate fronts interact simultaneously. The Western proxy strategy relies heavily on financial isolation and technological friction, actively attempting to starve the opposing war machine of both capital and high-end components. In response, the adversary deploys an adaptive counter-strategy, leveraging shadow logistics to bypass financial caps and using agricultural soft power to outflank diplomatic isolation. This dynamic exposes a critical misconception among policy analysts: the belief that economic sanctions function as a standalone cure for state aggression. The structural reality of the 21st century is that we live in a multipolar landscape. A targeted nation will always find alternative trading partners, willing to absorb its exports and supply its needs. Because economic constraints can be bypassed, they require kinetic pushback to remain effective. Ukraine had to actively defend a humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea with naval strikes just to keep its own grain shipments moving. Geoeconomic isolation is inherently imperfect. To succeed, it absolutely must be paired with continuous, direct material and financial support to the defending proxy state. All the abstract data regarding trade flows and supply chains ultimately dictates the physical reality on the ground, determining who has the armor, the ammunition, and the capital to continue fighting. The structural framework of the Cold War proxy conflict has updated its arsenal, shifting to fit the complexities of a highly globalized era. In an interconnected world, modern proxy wars are ultimate tests of systemic endurance. Victory belongs to the side that successfully outlasts the other's economic friction.